The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Sarah Martinez had been expecting it for weeks, but when her father's voice crackled through the speaker with those familiar words of disappointment, she felt something inside her chest tighten like a vice. "Another one of your wild stories, Sarah. When are you going to grow up and face reality? You're 32 years old, living in some fantasy world where you think you're important. You're nothing but a disappointment." What her father didn't know was that 3 hours later, Sarah would receive a call that would change everything. A call that would make him eat every single word he'd ever said about her being a failure. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Sarah had always been different. Growing up in the small town of Cedar Falls, Montana, she was the girl who read military history books instead of romance novels, who spent her weekends at the shooting range with her grandfather instead of at the mall with friends. Her father, Robert Martinez, owned the largest construction company in 3 counties and had built an empire from nothing. He was a man who measured success in dollar signs and tangible achievements. "You're wasting your potential," he'd tell Sarah every time she mentioned her plans to join the military after high school. "Construction, real estate, business, that's where the real money is. The military is for people who can't make it in the real world." But Sarah had made up her mind. At 18, against her father's violent protests, she enlisted in the Army. Robert refused to attend her graduation from basic training. When she called home to share her excitement about being selected for advanced intelligence training, he hung up on her. "You're throwing your life away for some government fantasy," were his last words to her before she deployed for the first time. The years that followed were a blur of classified assignments and sleepless nights. Sarah couldn't tell her family where she was or what she was doing. All they knew was that she was somewhere overseas, playing soldier. As her father liked to put it during family gatherings, she was never there to attend. Her mother, Elena, would try to defend her during these conversations, but Robert's voice always boomed louder. She could have had everything handed to her. Instead, she chose to disappear into some military bureaucracy where she'll retire as a nobody. The worst part wasn't his anger. It was his complete dismissal of her abilities. When Sarah would call home during her rare breaks, trying to share small details of her life that weren't classified, Robert would cut her off. "I don't want to hear about your little adventures, Sarah. When you're ready to come home and do something meaningful with your life, then we'll talk." What he didn't understand was that Sarah couldn't tell him about the 3 terrorist cells she'd helped dismantle in Afghanistan. She couldn't mention the intelligence network she'd built across Eastern Europe, or the fact that her analyses had prevented attacks that would have killed thousands of civilians. She couldn't explain that generals twice her age sought her advice, or that she'd been personally commended by officials whose names would make headlines. The secrecy was killing her relationship with her family, but it was the price of the work she'd chosen. Every successful mission, every life saved, every threat neutralized, none of it existed in her father's world because she couldn't prove it. Her younger brother Miguel tried to bridge the gap during family video calls. "Dad, you should be proud of Sarah. She's serving our country." "Serving?" Robert's laugh was bitter. "She's hiding behind some desk job, afraid to face the real world. I built something with my hands, something people can see." What has she built? Nothing. The breaking point came during her last visit home, 18 months ago. Sarah had been back for only 3 days when Robert cornered her in the kitchen after dinner. "Look at you," he said, gesturing at her civilian clothes. 30 years old, and what do you have to show for it? No house, no business, no real career. Your cousin Danny just bought his 2nd dealership. Your high school classmate Jennifer owns 3 restaurants. And you? You're still playing dress-up in someone else's uniform." Sarah had stood there, thinking about the medal locked away in her apartment, a decoration she couldn't display or discuss, given to her by officials she couldn't name, for work she couldn't describe. She thought about the letter of commendation from the Secretary of Defense sitting in her classified personnel file, praising her exceptional strategic thinking and unparalleled dedication to national security. "You don't understand what I do, Dad." "I understand enough," Robert shot back. "You're a wasted soldier." All that intelligence, all that potential, and you threw it away to take orders from people who don't care about you. You could have been somebody important. That night, Sarah lay in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling she'd stared at as a teenager when she'd dreamed of making a difference in the world. She'd achieved more than she'd ever imagined possible, but none of it mattered to the person whose approval she'd always craved most. The next morning, she left without saying goodbye. For the past year and a half, their communication had been reduced to stilted phone calls every few months. Elena would update Sarah on family news while Robert remained conspicuously absent from the conversations. When he did speak to her, it was with the tone of someone addressing a child who disappointed them beyond redemption. The call that night had been no different. Sarah had mentioned she might be coming home soon, that there might be some changes in her career, and Robert had launched into his familiar routine about her wasted life and poor choices. What he didn't know was that Sarah had spent the last 3 years being quietly promoted through ranks that didn't officially exist. She'd been handpicked for assignments that required the highest security clearances, trusted with information that could reshape international relations. Her work had taken her from war zones to the Pentagon, from classified briefings with foreign ambassadors to strategy sessions with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. 3 months ago, she'd received news that changed everything. The promotion had been unanimous, a decision made at levels of government that most people never knew existed. But due to the sensitive nature of her work, the official announcement had been delayed while security protocols were established. Now, finally, the call was coming. In a few hours, Sarah's phone would ring with news that would make her father's words echo in his mind for the rest of his life. She sat in her apartment in Virginia looking at the framed photo of her family, the last picture they'd taken together before she'd enlisted. Her father stood proud and confident, his arm around her shoulders, back when he still believed she might follow in his footsteps. Soon, Robert Martinez would learn exactly what his daughter had become. And for the first time in 14 years, Sarah smiled, thinking about calling him back. The morning started like any other in Sarah's Arlington apartment. Coffee at 5:30 a.m., encrypted emails by 6 o'clock, and a secure briefing scheduled for 7:45. But today felt different. The anticipation that had been building for months was finally reaching its crescendo. Her secure phone buzzed with a message that made her pulse quicken. Stand by for official notification at 0900 hours. Sarah had been through this process before. Promotions in the intelligence community weren't announced with fanfare or ceremonies. They happened quietly, in sterile conference rooms with officials whose faces never appeared in newspapers. But this promotion was different. This one would require a public acknowledgement that had been 3 years in the making. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away in Cedar Falls, Robert Martinez was having breakfast with his foreman, discussing the timeline for their latest commercial project. The Riverside shopping complex was his biggest contract yet, a $47 million development that would employ half the town for the next 2 years. "Does your daughter ever think about coming back to help with the business?" asked Tom Bradley, Robert's longtime friend and project manager. "A smart girl like that could probably handle the engineering side." Robert's jaw tightened as he spread blueprints across the kitchen table. "Sarah's too busy playing army to think about real work. 14 years she's been chasing some childhood fantasy. At least Miguel had the sense to get his business degree." What Robert didn't know was that while he was planning shopping centers, his daughter had spent the previous month in a series of closed-door meetings at the Pentagon. Defense Secretary Patricia Hayes had personally overseen the final security clearances. CIA Director James Morrison had signed off on the operational transition. Even the President's National Security Advisor had weighed in on the decision. The position Sarah was about to assume didn't officially exist in any public organizational chart. It was a role that had been created specifically for her, combining her expertise in counterintelligence, strategic analysis, and field operations into something unprecedented in military history. Back in Virginia, Sarah's secure line rang at exactly 9 a.m. "Major Martinez, this is General Catherine Wells, Joint Chiefs of Staff. Are you prepared to receive official notification?" Sarah straightened in her chair. "Yes, ma'am." By unanimous decision of the Joint Chiefs, with approval from the Secretary of Defense and confirmation from the National Security Council, You are hereby promoted to the rank of Brigadier General, effective immediately. Your new assignment as Director of Strategic Intelligence Operations begins Monday." The words hit Sarah like a physical force. At 32, she was about to become one of the youngest generals in modern military history. But more than that, she was being handed control of an intelligence division that most generals didn't even know existed. "General Martinez, your first briefing with the Joint Chiefs is scheduled for 1400 hours today. Transportation has been arranged." "And General?" "Yes, ma'am?" A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Welcome to a very exclusive club. There are currently only 18 active female generals in the entire U.S. military. We're proud to have you among us. After the call ended, Sarah sat in stunned silence. 14 years of sacrifice, of missed family gatherings, of her father's disappointed sighs and cutting remarks about her wasted potential. All of it had led to this moment. Her personal phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Your father's been in a terrible mood all morning. He keeps talking about how you never call anymore. Maybe you could reach out." Sarah stared at the message, thinking about the irony. In a few hours, she would be sitting in the Pentagon's most secure conference room, receiving briefings on threats that could destabilize entire regions. She would have access to intelligence that world leaders would kill for. She would command resources that most countries could only dream of. But first, she had a different kind of mission to complete. The phone call to Cedar Falls went straight to voicemail. Robert was probably on the construction site, barking orders at his crew while cement trucks rumbled in the background. Sarah waited for the beep. "Dad, it's me. I know you're busy with the new project, but I wanted to call and tell you something important. I'm finally coming home for a visit. There's been a development in my career that I think you should know about. I'll try calling again later." She hung up, knowing that Robert would probably delete the message without listening to the whole thing. He'd done it before. Her mother had mentioned it during one of their private conversations. The drive to the Pentagon took 45 minutes in midday traffic. Sarah had made this trip hundreds of times over the past 3 years. But today the familiar landmarks looked different. The Jefferson Memorial, the Washington Monument, the Potomac River, all of it seemed to shimmer with new significance. Inside the Pentagon, Sarah's escort led her through corridors she'd never seen before, past security checkpoints that required retinal scans and voice recognition, into elevators that descended to levels that didn't appear on any building directory. The briefing room was smaller than she'd expected, with a polished mahogany table surrounded by 12 chairs. Maps covered the walls, not the kind you'd find in any public atlas, but detailed intelligence overlays showing global threat assessments, resource deployments, and strategic positioning that represented decades of classified analysis. General Wells stood at the head of the table, flanked by officials Sarah recognized from intelligence briefings but had never met in person. The Deputy Director of the CIA, the Commander of Special Operations, the Secretary of Defense herself. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Wells announced, "I present Brigadier General Sarah Martinez, our new Director of Strategic Intelligence Operations." The title still felt surreal. Sarah had spent so many years being Major Martinez or simply Martinez in field reports. Now she was a general, a rank that commanded instant respect and carried weight in rooms where world-changing decisions were made daily. The briefing that followed lasted 3 hours. Sarah learned about operations spanning 6 continents, intelligence networks that had taken decades to establish, and threats so sensitive that fewer than 50 people in the entire government knew they existed. She would now be responsible for coordinating responses to international incidents before they became front-page news. As she left the Pentagon that evening, Sarah's phone buzzed with a missed call from home. Her mother had left a voicemail. "Sarah, honey, your father listened to your message. He wants to know what kind of development you're talking about. He seems curious. Call when you can." Sarah smiled as she walked to her car. Curious was a start. Tomorrow morning, she would make a call that would change everything. But tonight, she wanted to savor this moment. the culmination of every difficult decision, every sacrifice, every night she'd fallen asleep wondering if her father would ever understand. In 12 hours, Robert Martinez would learn that his soldier daughter had just become one of the most powerful military officers in the United States. And Sarah couldn't wait to hear the silence on the other end of that call. Saturday morning in Cedar Falls arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Robert Martinez feel invincible. He stood on the roof of the half-finished Riverside shopping complex, surveying his domain like a king overlooking his kingdom. $47 million of concrete and steel rising from Montana soil, all because of his vision and determination. His phone rang as he climbed down from the scaffolding. Elena's name flashed on the screen. "Robert, Sarah's been trying to reach you. She says it's urgent." "Everything's urgent with Sarah," he muttered, wiping concrete dust from his hands. "What's she want now? More money for another one of her military adventures?" "She won't tell me what it's about. Just says she needs to talk to you directly. She sounds different." Robert had heard that tone in his wife's voice before. Elena had always been Sarah's defender, even when their daughter was making the worst decisions of her life. Different how? Excited. Nervous. I don't know, Robert. Just call her. An hour later, as Robert sat in his home office surrounded by architectural drawings and contract proposals, he finally dialed Sarah's number. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Dad? Elena says you have something urgent to discuss. Make it quick. I've got 3 contractor meetings this afternoon." There was a pause on the other end. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried a weight Robert had never heard before. "I wanted to tell you myself before you heard it from someone else. Yesterday I received some news about my career." Robert leaned back in his leather chair, the same chair where he'd signed his first $1 million contract 15 years ago. "What kind of news? They finally realize you're wasted in whatever desk job you've been doing?" "I've been promoted, Dad." "Promoted to what? Lieutenant Colonel? Big deal. Your cousin Danny just got promoted to regional sales manager for the entire Northwest. That's a promotion that means something." Sarah's silence stretched long enough that Robert wondered if the call had dropped. Then she spoke, and her words came out carefully measured, like she was reading from a script. "I've been promoted to Brigadier General." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. He sat forward so quickly that architectural drawings scattered across his desk. "What did you say?" "Brigadier General, Dad, 1 star. I'm also being appointed as Director of Strategic Intelligence Operations." Robert's mind reeled. "General? Hi, Sarah. The girl who used to build sandcastles in the backyard, who couldn't even negotiate a decent allowance raise when she was 15. That's impossible. You're 32 years old. Generals are old men with gray hair and decades of experience." "Apparently, I have more experience than you realize." Quote. For the first time in years, Robert Martinez was speechless. He'd built his entire identity around being the successful one in the family, the person who understood how the real world worked. Generals were the people who appeared on CNN during international crises. They were the ones who sat in the Pentagon making decisions that affected millions of lives. "You're serious," he said finally. "Dead serious. The promotion is effective immediately. My first briefing with the Joint Chiefs was yesterday afternoon." Robert stood up, pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. "How is this possible? You've been in the military for 14 years. You've never mentioned anything about being in line for a promotion like this." "That's because most of what I do is classified, Dad, the work I've been doing. I couldn't tell you about it even if I wanted to, but it's been building to this for years." The reality began to sink in like cold water. All those times Robert had dismissed Sarah's career as meaningless, all the comments about her wasting her potential. She had been climbing a ladder he didn't even know existed. "What does Director of Strategic Intelligence Operations mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It means I'm responsible for coordinating intelligence operations across multiple agencies: CIA, NSA, Defense Intelligence Agency. They all report to my office on certain matters. I have a security clearance that allows me access to information that maybe 50 people in the entire government can see." Robert slumped back into his chair. 50 people in the entire government. He thought about his own achievements, the biggest construction projects in 3 counties, contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. Suddenly, they felt small. Why didn't you tell me any of this before? Because I couldn't, and because you never asked what I actually did. You just assumed I was failing. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Robert remembered every dismissive comment, every time he'd compared Sarah unfavorably to her cousins or former classmates. Every family gathering where he'd bragged about Miguel's business success while glossing over Sarah's military service. A general, he repeated, still trying to process the information. My daughter is a general. Your daughter has been briefing senators on national security threats for the past 2 years. Your daughter has prevented terrorist attacks that would have killed thousands of people. Your daughter just became one of only 18 female generals in the entire U.S. military. Each revelation hit Robert like a hammer blow. While he'd been worried about Sarah's lack of visible success, she'd been operating at levels of government that most people only saw in movies. The ceremony is next Friday at the Pentagon, Sarah continued. It's mostly a formality. The real work started yesterday. But there will be a small reception afterward. The Secretary of Defense will be there, a few senators, some other officials. Robert's throat felt dry. You want me to come? I want my family there, Dad. I've spent 14 years not being able to share my achievements with the people who matter most to me. This is the first time I can actually show you what I've been building. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years, Robert had lectured Sarah about building something tangible, something people could see and respect. Now he realized she'd been building something far more substantial than anything he'd ever imagined. She'd just been building it in shadows. Sarah, Robert started, then stopped. How do you apologize for 14 years of fundamental misunderstanding? How do you take back every dismissive comment, every expression of disappointment? I know, Dad. We'll have time to talk about everything when I get home. But right now, I need to know, will you be there next Friday? Robert looked around his office, at the photos of completed buildings, the framed contracts, the awards from the Montana Construction Association. All of it still mattered, but suddenly it felt like looking at toys in comparison to what his daughter had achieved. Wild horses couldn't keep me away, he said, and for the first time in years he meant every word he spoke to her. After hanging up, Robert sat in stunned silence. Outside his window, he could see the Riverside shopping complex rising against the Montana sky. His greatest achievement, the project he'd planned to celebrate for months. But now all he could think about was his daughter, standing in the Pentagon briefing the most powerful people in the world on matters of national security. General Sarah Martinez. He was going to have to get used to that title. The week that followed Robert's phone call with Sarah moved in slow motion and hyperspeed simultaneously. He found himself distracted during contractor meetings, his mind wandering from concrete specifications to the impossibility of his daughter's new reality. Elena caught him Googling youngest female generals in U.S. military history at 2 a.m., his laptop screen casting blue light across their bedroom. You need to sleep, she whispered. Did you know that the average age for promotion to general is 51? Robert replied, not looking away from the screen. Sarah's 19 years younger than average. 19 years. Elena smiled in the darkness. I always knew she was special. You knew she was going to become a general? I knew she was going to prove you wrong eventually. The words stung because they were true. Elena had defended Sarah through every argument, every frustrated phone call where Robert complained about their daughter's choices. Now he wondered what else his wife had seen that he'd missed. By Wednesday, Robert had done something he'd never done before. He'd delegated the entire Riverside project to Tom Bradley and cleared his schedule for the rest of the week. For a man who hadn't taken a vacation in 8 years, the decision felt monumental. You sure about this, boss? Tom asked, reviewing the stack of authorization forms Robert had signed. The concrete pour is scheduled for Monday. You've been planning this pour for 6 months. Handle it, Robert said, straightening his tie in the reflection of his office window. I've got somewhere more important to be. The flight from Billings to Washington, D.C. was Robert's first time on an airplane in over a decade. He'd always been too busy with local projects to travel, too focused on building his Montana empire to care about the wider world. As the plane lifted off, he watched the familiar landscape shrink below him. The construction sites that had defined his universe suddenly looking like toy blocks scattered across a sandbox. Elena squeezed his hand during takeoff. Nervous? Terrified, he admitted. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I don't understand what's happening? I spent 14 years telling her she was wasting her life, and now I find out she's been saving the country. Just be proud of her, Robert. That's all she's ever wanted. The Pentagon was nothing like Robert had imagined. He'd expected something grand and imposing, like the Montana State Capitol, but larger. Instead, it felt like a fortress designed by accountants, functional, secure, and utterly serious. Security checkpoints required multiple forms of identification. Metal detectors were followed by additional scanning procedures. By the time they reached the appropriate corridor, Robert felt like he was entering a different country. Sarah was waiting for them outside a conference room, marked only with a number. She wore her dress uniform, crisp, decorated with ribbons and insignia that Robert was only now beginning to understand represented real achievements. The single star on her shoulder seemed to catch every ray of light in the hallway. "Dad!" She stepped forward, and for a moment, Robert saw the little girl who used to help him carry tools to his work truck. "General Martinez," he said, the title feeling foreign on his tongue. Sarah laughed, and the sound cut through 14 years of tension. "You can still call me Sarah when we're not in official settings." "I think I need to get used to calling you General," Robert replied. "I have a lot of getting used to doing." The ceremony itself was smaller than Robert had anticipated, maybe 30 people in a windowless room with American flags and official portraits lining the walls. But the people in attendance made Robert's construction industry connections look like a community college networking event. The Secretary of Defense, Patricia Hayes, delivered remarks about Sarah's unprecedented contributions to national security and strategic intelligence. She mentioned operations in Afghanistan, counterintelligence work in Eastern Europe, and threat assessments that had literally prevented catastrophic attacks on American soil. With each accomplishment listed, Robert felt himself shrinking. While he'd been bragging about million-dollar construction contracts at family barbecues, his daughter had been preventing terrorist attacks. While he'd been winning local business awards, she'd been briefing senators on matters of international security. General Martinez represents the finest traditions of American military service, Secretary Hayes concluded. Her promotion to Director of Strategic Intelligence Operations reflects not just her exceptional abilities, but the trust our nation places in her judgment during the most critical situations. After the ceremony, during the reception, Robert found himself in conversations that were completely outside his experience. A CIA deputy director mentioned Sarah's, quote, innovative approaches to cross-agency coordination. A 3-star general from the Joint Chiefs praised her unique ability to synthesize complex intelligence into actionable strategies. "Your daughter is remarkable," said Senator Margaret Thompson, approaching Robert with a cocktail in hand. "I chair the Intelligence Committee, and I can tell you that Sarah's briefings have fundamentally changed how we approach several key national security issues." Robert nodded, trying to process the idea that senators, people he saw on television, were praising his daughter's work. "I'm still learning about what she actually does." "Most of us are," the senator replied. "Intelligence work operates in the shadows by necessity. But I can tell you this. The work Sarah has done in the past 3 years has made every American safer, even though they'll never know her name." Later, as the reception wound down, Robert found himself alone with Sarah in a small anteroom off the main conference area. Through the window, he could see the Potomac River and the Washington Monument in the distance. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. Sarah sat across from him, still in her dress uniform, but somehow looking more relaxed than she had all day. "You don't owe me anything, Dad." "Yes, I do. I spent 14 years telling you that you were wasting your potential. I compared you to your cousins, to your classmates, to anyone who had visible success. I made you feel like a failure when you were actually—" He gestured around the room, at the portraits of previous defense secretaries, at the flags and symbols of American power. "When you were actually doing this. You couldn't have known. Most of my work is classified. I couldn't tell you what I was really doing. But I could have trusted you. I could have believed that you knew what you were doing with your own life. Instead, I measured your worth by my standards in my world, using my definition of success. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the Washington skyline. Do you know what the hardest part was? Not the deployments, not the classified work, not even the physical danger. It was coming home for visits and seeing disappointment in your eyes. It was knowing that you thought I was a failure. Robert felt something break inside his chest. You were never a failure. I was just too stubborn and too narrow-minded to see what you were building. I spent so many nights wondering if you'd ever be proud of me. I am proud of you right now. I'm proud of who you've become, what you've accomplished. But more than that, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every dismissive comment, every comparison, every time I made you feel like you weren't enough. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, her back to him. When she turned around, there were tears in her eyes. I want to start over, Dad. I want to have a relationship where we actually talk to each other. Where you know who I really am. Robert stood and crossed the room, pulling his daughter into a hug that was 14 years overdue. I'd like that too, General. As they embraced, Robert realized that the most important construction project of his life wasn't made of concrete and steel. It was rebuilding the relationship with his daughter, a project that would require all the skill, patience, and dedication he'd ever brought to any job site. But for the first time in years, he was confident he could build something that would last. 6 months after the Pentagon ceremony, Robert Martinez stood in his newly expanded office, but this time he wasn't alone. Framed photographs lined his desk, not just of construction projects, but of Sarah in her dress uniform. Sarah shaking hands with the Secretary of Defense, and Sarah receiving a commendation from officials whose names Robert was still learning to pronounce. The biggest change, however, wasn't in his office decor. It was in his phone calls. Tom, I need you to handle the morning walkthrough, Robert said into his headset while reviewing blueprints. Sarah's calling at 10, and I don't want any interruptions. Tom Bradley nearly dropped his coffee. 6 months ago, Robert would have moved a senator's phone call to accommodate a concrete delivery. Now he was rearranging entire project schedules around conversations with his daughter. The transformation had been gradual but profound. What started as awkward weekly check-ins had evolved into genuine conversations about everything from international relations to family memories they'd both forgotten. Sarah couldn't discuss specific operations, but she could talk about the broader challenges of her work, managing interagency politics, adapting to rapid technological changes in intelligence gathering, and the weight of making decisions that affected global security. Dad, you wouldn't believe the bureaucracy, Sarah had laughed during their previous call. I thought construction permits were complicated. Try coordinating intelligence sharing between 12 different agencies, each with their own protocols and territorial disputes. Robert had found himself offering advice from his business experience. How to manage competing personalities, how to navigate complex approval processes, how to maintain authority while building consensus. For the first time in their relationship, they were talking as equals, sharing professional challenges across very different worlds. The personal revelations had been even more meaningful. Sarah had started sharing stories from her deployments, not the classified details, but the human moments. The Afghan interpreter who had risked his life to provide intelligence, and whom Sarah had helped relocate to the United States with his family. The Christmas she'd spent in a forward operating base, video calling home while explosions echoed in the distance. The weight of responsibility when lives depended on her analysis being correct. I carry a lot with me, Dad, she'd admitted during one late-night conversation. Sometimes I wonder if the cost has been worth it. The cost? Missing Miguel's wedding because I was deployed. Not being there when Grandpa died. 14 years of family dinners where everyone else had stories to share, and I had to sit quietly because mine were classified. Robert had felt the full weight of his past dismissiveness in that moment. While Sarah had been carrying the burden of protecting the country, he'd been adding to her isolation by making her feel like a failure. But the relationship wasn't just healing old wounds. It was creating new connections. Robert had started following international news with an intensity that surprised Elena. He'd subscribed to defense publications, learned the difference between tactical and strategic intelligence, and could now hold conversations about geopolitical developments that would have bored him senseless a year ago. "You've become quite the foreign policy expert," Elena had teased him after finding him reading a book about cyber warfare. "I want to understand her world," Robert had replied. "For 14 years, I dismissed something I didn't even try to comprehend." The changes extended beyond their father-daughter relationship. Robert's perspective on his own business had evolved dramatically. The Riverside shopping complex, once his crowning achievement, was now just one project among many. He'd started taking on government contracts, veterans' housing developments, infrastructure projects for military installations. Nothing that would create conflicts with Sarah's classified work, but opportunities to contribute to the same mission of serving the country. More significantly, Robert had begun using his influence in the construction industry to support military families. He'd hired 3 veterans in the past 4 months, created internship programs for transitioning service members, and had quietly started a scholarship fund for children of deployed military personnel. "It's not charity," he'd explained to his board of directors. "These people have skills and dedication that most civilian workers can't match. Hiring veterans isn't just the right thing to do, it's good business." The ripple effects had surprised everyone, including Robert himself. His company's reputation had grown beyond Montana. Military publications had featured his veteran hiring initiatives. The Department of Veterans Affairs had invited him to speak at transition assistance programs. Suddenly, Robert Martinez wasn't just a successful contractor, he was an advocate for the military community his daughter served. But perhaps the most profound change was in how Robert talked about Sarah. Family gatherings that once featured awkward silences when Sarah's career came up now became opportunities for Robert to beam with pride. He couldn't discuss the classified details of her work, but he could talk about her rank, her responsibilities, and the respect she commanded at the highest levels of government. "My daughter briefed the president last month," he'd mentioned casually at a Montana Contractors Association dinner, watching jaws drop around the table. The statement was technically accurate. Sarah had been part of a team that provided intelligence updates to the National Security Council, which included presidential briefings. But for Robert, it represented something larger: the ability to finally acknowledge his daughter's extraordinary achievements in public. Miguel had noticed the change during his last visit to Cedar Falls. "Dad's like a different person when he talks about Sarah now," he'd told Elena privately. "Remember how he used to change the subject whenever anyone asked about her? Now he can't stop talking about her work." The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Robert occasionally caught himself slipping into old patterns, measuring success in dollars and visible achievements. But now Sarah would gently correct him, helping him understand different ways to evaluate accomplishment and impact. "Dad, you built structures that will stand for decades and employ hundreds of people," she'd said during one conversation. "I work on problems that most people will never know existed. Both matter, both serve the community. They're just different forms of service." These conversations had led Robert to a deeper understanding of patriotism itself. For years, he'd thought of serving the country in abstract terms: paying taxes, voting, displaying flags. Now he understood service as something more personal and immediate. Sarah wasn't just working for the government. She was actively protecting the freedoms that allowed him to build his business, raise his family, and live without fear of the threats she countered daily. The phone rang at exactly 10 o'clock, as it had every Tuesday for the past 6 months. "Good morning, General," Robert answered, the title now rolling off his tongue naturally. "Morning, Dad. How's the new veterans housing project coming along?" Robert smiled, looking out his office window at the construction site where former military personnel were building homes for other former military personnel. It was a project that combined his expertise with his newfound understanding of service, creating something meaningful beyond profit margins. "Groundbreaking is next week. The local VA office is sending someone to speak at the ceremony. I was wondering." Robert paused, still not entirely comfortable with asking for favors. "Would you be interested in saying a few words? I know you can't travel often, but it would mean a lot to the families." Sarah's laughter came through the phone, warm and genuine. "I'd be honored, Dad. Let me check my briefing schedule and see what I can arrange." As they talked about logistics and timing, Robert marveled at how natural the conversation felt. 6 months ago, they could barely manage stilted small talk. Now they were collaborating on projects that bridged their different worlds. After hanging up, Robert returned to his blueprints, but with a different perspective than he'd had that morning. Each line represented not just a building, but a home for someone who had served the country alongside his daughter. Each measurement was part of a structure that would house families who understood sacrifice in ways he was only beginning to appreciate. The work felt bigger now, connected to something beyond profit and local recognition. For the first time in his career, Robert Martinez was building with purpose that extended far beyond the Montana horizon. 1 year after Sarah's promotion, the Martinez family found themselves in a situation none of them could have predicted. They were sitting around a conference table at the White House, waiting for the President of the United States to join them for what the staff had described as an, quote, informal appreciation meeting. Robert adjusted his tie for the 4th time, still not quite believing where he was. The West Wing bustled around them with the kind of organized chaos he recognized from his own construction sites, except here the stakes involved national security rather than building permits. "Stop fidgeting, Dad," Sarah whispered, though she was smiling. "You've negotiated million-dollar contracts. This is just another meeting." "Just another meeting," Robert muttered, "with the Commander-in-Chief, in the White House. Because my daughter prevented an international incident that I'm not allowed to know the details of." Elena reached over and patted his hand. "Breathe, Robert. Sarah deals with this kind of thing every day." What had brought them to this moment was a crisis that had dominated headlines for 3 weeks. A cyber attack on critical infrastructure that could have crippled the East Coast power grid. The media reported that quick action by intelligence agencies had prevented catastrophe, but they didn't know the specifics. Robert didn't know the specifics either, but he knew his daughter had been working 18-hour days, sleeping in her Pentagon office, and coordinating responses across multiple agencies. The only detail Sarah could share was that her intelligence division had identified the threat 48 hours before it would have been executed, giving other agencies time to implement countermeasures. The president had personally requested this meeting to thank the key personnel involved, and Sarah had been allowed to bring her family. General Martinez saved potentially millions of Americans from weeks without power during winter, the chief of staff had explained when he'd called to arrange the meeting. The president wanted to express his gratitude personally, and to meet the family that raised someone with such dedication to public service. The irony wasn't lost on Robert. For years, he'd criticized Sarah for pursuing a career that seemed to offer no recognition, no visible achievements, no tangible rewards. Now the highest office in the land was acknowledging her work, even if the details would remain classified for decades. President William Harrison entered the room with the kind of presence Robert had only seen in movies. Tall, silver-haired, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of lives. But when he shook Robert's hand, his demeanor was warm and personal. "Mr. Martinez, I understand you're in construction, building things that last, creating jobs, serving your community. That's the kind of work that makes America strong." "Thank you, Mr. President. Though I have to say, what my daughter does makes my work look pretty simple." President Harrison laughed. "Don't sell yourself short. Sarah tells me you've created some impressive veteran housing projects. Supporting military families is just as important as the intelligence work we do here." Robert blinked in surprise. Sarah had told the president about his veteran housing projects. During briefings on national security threats, his daughter had mentioned his construction work. "Sarah's very proud of how you've evolved your business to serve the military community," the president continued. "She says you've hired more veterans in the past year than some Fortune 500 companies." "It seemed like the right thing to do," Robert replied, still processing that his business decisions were being discussed at presidential levels. "It is the right thing, and it's effective. Some of our best intelligence analysts are veterans who learned their skills in the field. The transition support you provide makes a real difference." The meeting that followed lasted 40 minutes. President Harrison asked thoughtful questions about Robert's construction projects, Elena's work as a school principal, and Miguel's expanding business ventures. But the focus kept returning to Sarah's achievements and the impact of her intelligence work. "General Martinez represents everything we hope for in our military leadership," the president said. Brilliant, dedicated, able to see connections that others miss. Her work on this recent crisis probably prevented an economic disaster that would have affected every American family. After the formal meeting, as they walked through the West Wing toward the exit, Sarah pulled her father aside. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been waiting for the right moment to share." Robert's pulse quickened. After a year of revelations about his daughter's career, he'd learned to expect the unexpected. "I've been offered a new position. It would mean leaving the Pentagon and moving to a different kind of role." "What kind of position?" Sarah glanced around, ensuring they were out of earshot of other visitors. "The CIA has created a new deputy director position, focused on emerging threats, cyber warfare, international terrorism, technological espionage. They want me to head up the division." Robert stopped walking entirely. "Deputy director of the CIA? It's not official yet. The Senate Intelligence Committee has to approve the appointment, but the director recommended me personally." "You're 33 years old, and they want to make you deputy director of the CIA? The threats we're facing don't wait for people to reach traditional career milestones, Dad. Age is less important than understanding how modern warfare actually works." As they rejoined Elena and Miguel, Robert's mind was spinning. A year ago, he'd thought his daughter was wasting her potential in some meaningless military job. Now she was being considered for one of the most powerful intelligence positions in the world. But beyond the prestige and importance of the role, Robert realized something else. He was no longer surprised by Sarah's success. The shocked disbelief he'd felt when she first told him about her general's promotion had been replaced by a different emotion entirely. Pride, yes, but also a quiet confidence that whatever challenge Sarah faced, she would handle it with the same intelligence and dedication she'd shown throughout her career. The drive back to their hotel was quiet, each family member processing the surreal experience of meeting the president. Finally, Miguel broke the silence. "So Sarah's probably going to be running the CIA someday, isn't she?" Sarah laughed. "Let's focus on the deputy director position first. One intelligence agency at a time." "I'm serious," Miguel continued. "You've been promoted faster than anyone in modern history. You've got the president's personal attention. Where does this trajectory lead?" Elena turned around from the front seat. "It leads wherever Sarah wants it to lead. That's what we should have understood from the beginning." Robert caught his daughter's eyes in the rearview mirror. "The Senate confirmation process, is that going to be difficult?" "It's thorough. Background investigations, public hearings, questions about my experience and qualifications. Some senators will probably wonder if I'm too young for the position." "And what will you tell them?" Sarah smiled, and Robert saw in her expression the same determination she'd shown as a child when she decided to build the most elaborate treehouse in the neighborhood. "I'll tell them about the terrorist cells we've dismantled, the cyber attacks we've prevented, and the international crises we've resolved before they became public knowledge. I'll explain that modern threats require modern approaches, and that experience matters more than tenure. And if they ask about your family background, I'll tell them I learned about hard work and integrity from a father who built a successful business from nothing. I'll say I learned about education and community service from a mother who dedicated her career to teaching. I'll explain that I come from people who understand what it means to serve others." Robert felt something shift in his chest. For so many years, he'd worried that Sarah's military career would prevent her from having a normal family life and would keep her isolated from the values and connections that mattered. Now he realized that everything she'd accomplished had been built on the foundation they'd provided, even when he couldn't see it. "When do you find out about the appointment?" Elena asked. "The formal nomination should be announced next month. Senate hearings probably in the spring. If everything goes well, I'll start the new position by summer." As their car pulled up to the hotel, Robert looked back at the White House, now lit up against the evening sky. Somewhere in that building, decisions were being made that would affect the entire world. And soon, his daughter would be part of those conversations at the highest level. "Sarah," he said as they got out of the car, "I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. I'm proud of you. Not just because of your achievements, but because of who you are. You've stayed true to your values while operating in a world I can barely comprehend." Quote. Sarah hugged him. And Robert realized that this embrace felt different from all the others over the past year. There was no lingering tension, no unspoken disappointments, no barriers created by misunderstanding. For the first time in their relationship, they were simply a father and daughter who understood and respected each other completely. And Robert knew that whatever came next in Sarah's extraordinary career, their relationship could handle it. 2 years later, on a crisp October morning in Cedar Falls, Robert Martinez stood at the podium of the newly constructed Martinez Veterans Community Center, looking out at a crowd of 300 people. Local families, military personnel from the nearby airbase, state officials, and reporters from regional news stations had gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. But Robert's eyes were focused on the front row, where Sarah sat in her civilian clothes, taking a rare weekend away from her duties as Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The Senate confirmation process had been grueling but successful, with Sarah becoming the youngest Deputy Director in the agency's history at age 34. 3 years ago, Robert began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, I thought I understood what success looked like. I measured achievement in square footage and profit margins. I believed that anything you couldn't see, touch, or count wasn't really valuable. He paused, looking directly at Sarah, who smiled encouragingly. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but mostly I was wrong about my daughter. The community center behind him represented 18 months of planning and construction. It housed job training programs for transitioning veterans, mental health services, family support groups, and educational resources. The project had cost $3.2 million, funded entirely through Robert's construction company profits and donations he'd solicited from other Montana businesses. But the building was just the visible part of something larger. In the past 2 years, Robert's veteran hiring initiative had expanded into a statewide program. 47 Montana construction companies now participated in structured veteran employment programs. The model had been replicated in 6 other states, with Robert consulting on implementation. My daughter taught me that the most important work often happens in the shadows, Robert continued. That protecting others sometimes means sacrificing recognition. That serving your country isn't always about parades and ceremonies. Sometimes it's about preventing disasters that no one will ever know were coming. Sarah had been deputy director for 8 months now, overseeing operations that spanned the globe. She couldn't discuss the specifics, but Robert had learned to read between the lines of news reports. When international crises were resolved quietly, when terrorist plots were disrupted before reaching headlines, when cyber attacks were thwarted without public awareness, Robert suspected his daughter's fingerprints were somewhere in the response. The irony was that as Sarah's work became more classified and invisible, Robert's understanding of its importance had grown exponentially. He'd educated himself about intelligence operations, cyber warfare, and international terrorism. He understood now that the absence of major attacks on American soil wasn't luck. It was the result of dedicated professionals working around the clock to identify and neutralize threats. This community center exists because my daughter showed me a different way to measure success, Robert said, gesturing toward the building. Success isn't just about what you build for yourself. It's about what you build for others. It's about using your skills to serve something larger than your own ambitions. In the audience, Elena wiped tears from her eyes. She'd watched her husband transform from a man obsessed with his own achievements into someone who understood that legacy came from lifting others up. The change hadn't happened overnight, but it had been thorough and genuine. Miguel, now running the day-to-day operations of Martinez Construction, had embraced his father's new direction. The company had become a model for veteran employment in the construction industry, with Miguel leading training programs and mentorship initiatives that prepared former military personnel for civilian careers. But this center isn't just about veterans, Robert continued. It's about understanding that everyone who serves others, whether in the military, in education, in healthcare, in public safety, deserves our support and recognition. My wife Elena spent 30 years teaching children in this community. That's service. The paramedics who respond to emergencies at 3 a.m., that's service. The police officers, the firefighters, the social workers, they're all protecting and serving in their own ways. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, as the crowd moved inside for tours and refreshments, Sarah found herself in a quiet moment with her father in his office, which occupied a corner of the community center. The walls were lined with photos from construction projects, but also with certificates of appreciation from veteran organizations, newspaper clippings about the hiring initiatives, and a framed letter from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs commending Robert's contributions to veteran transition programs. "You know what the best part of this is?" Sarah asked, looking around the office. "What's that?" "You found your own way to serve. You didn't try to copy what I do or compete with it. You looked at your skills, your resources, your position in the community, and figured out how to use all of that to help others." Robert leaned back in his chair, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this point. "I spent so many years thinking that success was about building something impressive. Now I realize it's about building something meaningful." "They're not mutually exclusive, Dad. The Riverside Shopping Complex is still impressive. It provides jobs, serves the community, and contributes to the local economy. But now you're doing that and helping veterans transition to civilian careers and creating models that other states are copying. You've expanded your definition of impact." Through the office window, they could see families exploring the community center. Children playing in the childcare area while their veteran parents attended job training sessions. Support groups meeting in conference rooms. Counselors working with individuals struggling with PTSD and transition challenges. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" Robert said. "Do you ever regret the path you chose? The sacrifices, the secrecy, the weight of responsibility?" Sarah considered the question carefully. As deputy director, she now had access to intelligence briefings that revealed threats most Americans couldn't imagine. She knew about vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, about hostile foreign operations targeting American interests, about technological warfare that could cripple entire sectors of the economy. The responsibility was enormous and constant. "Every career involves sacrifices," she said finally. "You sacrifice time with your family to build your business. Mom sacrificed higher-paying opportunities to stay in public education. Miguel sacrificed his initial plans to work in Denver so he could help expand the family company. The difference is that my sacrifices are more visible because of the secrecy requirements." "But you're fulfilled by the work?" "I'm fulfilled by knowing that the work matters. Every threat we identify, every attack we prevent, every intelligence partnership we build, it all contributes to keeping people safe. When I see families like the ones here today, living their lives without fear, pursuing their dreams, raising their children in peace, that's what we're protecting." Robert nodded, understanding in a way that would have been impossible 3 years earlier. "And you know that whatever you're dealing with, whatever challenges you're facing, your family supports you completely." "That means everything to me, Dad. For so many years, I felt like I was fighting two battles: the professional challenges of intelligence work and the personal challenge of proving myself to you. Now I can focus all my energy on the job, knowing that you understand and respect what I'm doing." As evening approached and the community center event wound down, the Martinez family gathered for dinner at Elena's favorite restaurant in downtown Cedar Falls. The conversation flowed easily between Sarah's carefully sanitized stories from Washington, Miguel's updates on construction projects, Elena's tales from her current work as a substitute teacher, and Robert's plans for expanding the veteran programs. "You know what I realized today?" Elena said as they waited for dessert. "We've all found ways to serve others. Robert through the veteran programs, Miguel through ethical business practices and community employment, Sarah through intelligence work, and me through education. We've become a family that understands service." "Mom's right," Miguel added. "And it all started because Sarah had the courage to follow her own path, even when it meant disappointing Dad initially." Robert raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "Here's to being wrong about almost everything, and learning to be proud of it." Sarah laughed, raising her own cup. "Here's to a family that grows together, even when it takes a while to figure out how." Quote. As they left the restaurant, walking through the small downtown that Robert had helped develop through various construction projects, Sarah marveled at how different everything felt. The same streets, the same buildings, but a completely transformed understanding of her place in both her family and her community. Her phone buzzed with a secure text message, a situation developing overseas that would require her attention first thing Monday morning. Another crisis to manage, another threat to assess, Another challenge that would test everything she'd learned about leadership and intelligence operations. But for the first time in her career, Sarah could handle whatever came next with the complete confidence that her family understood her choices, supported her mission, and were proud of the person she'd become. The girl who had once felt like a disappointment to her father was now protecting the country as one of its most senior intelligence officials. And the father who had once dismissed her dreams was now serving veterans in his own community. Inspired by the daughter he'd finally learned to see clearly. Some stories end with dramatic confrontations or tearful reconciliations. This one ended with something more valuable. A family that had grown into mutual respect, shared purpose, and unconditional support. And in a world where threats constantly evolved and challenges never ended, that kind of foundation was worth more than any promotion, any building, or any measure of success that Robert Martinez had ever imagined. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.